Hello, and welcome to the first mini lecture of the second half of our Music 103 honors course. I'm going to try to keep these mini lectures short because I don't want you to spend a lot of time watching a PowerPoint presentation. One of the results of that is that I'm going to want you to get more of the concepts out of your reading and listening. Instead of doing sort of the question and answer that we were doing in class, I'm just going to highlight the most important points and go over things that I think are difficult to get from the reading. I will put a slide at the end of the second mini lecture that summarizes the sort of the important concepts that I wanted you to get from these lectures and from the readings together, and I hope that will be helpful to you. As we go along, I'm going to rely on you guys to give me feedback on whether things are clear and reasonable. This is a new experience teaching this way for me too. So I'll be looking to you if you need some additional support and assistance. So the topic of this mini lecture is to talk a little bit about classical period style, and then also to go over some of the forms that we see in instrumental music. So classical period style in many ways was a reaction against the elaboration and extravagance of Baroque style. In the second half of the 18th century, the stylistic pendulum swung the other way, and composers favored balance, logic, and order. And a visual analog of that are these two very familiar buildings that use, both built also in the second half of the 18th century. The one on the left is Thomas Jefferson's residence, Monticello in Virginia. The one on the right, of course, is the White House. Notice the simple geometric shapes, the symmetry. This is sort of the clear, logical, rationalistic approach that we associate with the second half of the 18th century. In music, that often meant simpler textures. You'll recall that homophonic texture became popular in the Baroque period, but classical homophonic textures are even simpler so that the melody stands out even more, and the accompaniment is often very simple. Also, the melodies tend to be more tuneful, singable. Often they are constructed with what we call balanced melodic phrasing. That's a concept I want you to understand, where often a melodic phrase is split in half, and the pattern is sort of a question and answer. So the first part and the second part often begin with the same melodic idea, and the first part seems to end up in the air, seems incomplete, and the second part completes the idea. A perfect example of this is the first phrase of Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik. The first half of the phrase goes up, and the second half of the phrase comes down. The first half of the phrase ends without a cadence. The second half of the phrase ends with a cadence. The first half of the phrase is 8 beats long. The second half of the phrase is also 8 beats long. And you can listen to that and count out those beats yourself. So one of the other things that happens in the classical period is that instrumental music gains in importance. So instrumental music becomes now almost more important than vocal music in a composer's repertoire. And as a result, composers were looking for ways to bring the drama and excitement that is associated with music that has words to music that doesn't have any words. They are trying to give their listeners a variety of different ways to have an emotional experience while they were listening to something that was not directly telling them a story with words. And they did that through a variety of different forms, that is, patterns of musical repetition that they felt their audiences could follow. Now, one thing that people often get confused about is they believe that, or they get the impression that it's only in the classical period that these forms emerged. Actually, there's instrumental form, there's musical form that's important in the medieval and the Renaissance and in the Baroque period. Musical form is still important, part of the reason we're going to spend so much time studying classical forms is because these are the same forms that are still used a lot today. So it's not that all of a sudden all the composers in the classical period were interested in rules and strict form. It's that these forms in instrumental music are still commonly used, so we're going to spend some extra time studying them. Okay, so let's delve in. One of my favorites, and maybe the easiest one to follow, is theme and variations. And we've looked at this before in the first unit of this course. Theme and variations, basically at the start of a piece, you're presented with a melody. The composer tries to make that melody memorable for you. He teaches you, or she teaches you, the tune. And then what happens is that melody is repeated over and over, but each time it's repeated, it's altered or embellished in some way. So what's interesting about theme and variations is that the same melody keeps coming back, but it's like it's wearing a different disguise every time. And sometimes the disguises can be very elaborate. The variations can appear to stray very far from the original theme. If the original theme is in a major key, the variations can switch to a minor key. Sometimes the variations can get so far away it's almost hard to remember the original melody. But that part of the enjoyment of listening to the theme variations is listening to the variety and the inventiveness with which the composer alters the original idea. Another form that your book goes over is known as the minuet trio form. The minuet is a dance. It originally was one of the dances in the Baroque dance suite. Remember those? The minuet is the only one of the Baroque dances that makes it out of the first half of the 18th century and is commonly featured in classical period music. The minuet is a dance that is in a moderate tempo and always in a meter of 3 beats. And when it's presented in a classical instrumental piece, usually there's one section that is kind of a single minuet. It's like one time through the dance, if you want to think of it that way. And then there's a second minuet, which is contrasting. So there's the first minuet, which we'll call section A, and then the second minuet you could call section B. That second minuet is often called the trio because originally that section usually featured fewer instruments. So that's the reason for the name minuet trio. Later on, often composers would feature the full ensemble in the trio as well as in the minuet. But usually there's some contrast, either a contrast of key, contrast of texture, or indeed contrast of instrumentation. After you hear that contrasting section, the original minuet music comes back. So the entire form is a big ternary form, A, B, A. And on the second repetition of the minuet, the second repetition of the A section, often this section is shortened. Usually each one of these sections, the A section and the B section, has 2 different melodic phrases. And you see that diagrammed here with small letters. So the A section has a melodic phrase that's then repeated. That's the 2 little A's. And then a second melodic phrase, and that one's repeated too, and that's the 2 little B's. The contrasting minuet, the B section, the trio, same thing, 2 melodies, each one repeated. When the original minuet comes back, often the repeats are eliminated. So that's why you see the second A and B in parentheses. So you just hear each one of the melodies one time instead of hearing them both repeated. That is the traditional pattern of a minuet trio. Another form that we often see is called rondo form. You might remember us talking about this one before. This is the one where we watched the Eurythmics video and talked about Sweet Dreams, that song from the 80s, being an example maybe of a rondo form. Your book actually mentions another song from the 80s, the Police song Every Breath You Take, which can also be seen as a kind of rondo form. Rondo is often used for the last movement of a piece of instrumental music because the A section usually features a melody or sometimes several melodies that are very tuneful and very memorable. So what happens in a rondo form is that A section keeps repeating throughout the piece, and in between those repetitions, there's contrasting musical material. So those are the other letters that you see here in this diagram, A, B, A, C, A. But each time after that contrasting material, the original material comes back. And the reason this was often used for the last movement of a piece is that rondo, after you hear a rondo, you're often left singing those melodies, humming those tuneful melodies of the A section that you've heard over and over and over. And a rondo always ends with its A section. It begins and ends with those tuneful melodies that, you know, the composer was hoping would stick in your head. Okay, this brings us to the most complex of the forms that we're going to study, but don't be afraid of it. This is the form that's known as sonata allegro form. That name is rather confusing. We've studied the sonata, and I'll talk about it a little more in the second mini lecture about genre. It's called sonata form because it originated in pieces that from that genre. It originated in the sonata. But it got so popular in the second half of the 18th century that it was used in concertos, and it was used in symphonies and all kinds of different pieces. So it transcended the sonata from whence it came, but it kept its name sonata form. The allegro part, usually it was used for the first movements of pieces, and they are often in a fast tempo, and allegro is the marking for fast tempo. In Italian, it literally means cheerful, but it's used for fast. But there are lots of slow pieces that are in sonata allegro form as well. So both halves of the name of this form are a bit confusing and misleading. All I can say is sorry about that from the classical music world. I'm sorry, you guys. Wish we had a better name for it, but we don't. There are 3 parts of sonata allegro form. And well, I like to think of it sort of as if you're writing an essay. Imagine you're writing an essay trying to convince somebody of something. Well, the first section of the essay, you lay out your ideas and you say, this is what my essay is going to be about, and this is what I'm going to try to convince you of. And that's the exposition of your essay. In sonata allegro form, in the exposition section, the composer introduces you to the musical material that the entire piece is going to be based on. And since you can't, in an essay, you can go back and reread, what you're reading to make sure you got it. You can't do that in music, usually. If you're hearing it performed live, you can't play it back again. So the composer repeats the exposition. That whole section is usually repeated just so that you get a chance, to understand the material, the important material that this piece is going to be based on. What makes the exposition, makes up the exposition are 2 sections that are in different keys. So the exposition begins in one key, and then it changes keys. There's a modulation. And then there's the second part of the exposition is in a different key. If the first key is a minor key, the tonic key is a minor key, then this new key is usually a major key. It's always a major key. If the first theme is in a major key, the second theme is in a different major key. That change, that shift of harmony is what was exciting for the classical listener. Often, the first thing you hear in the exposition is a memorable melody, and we call that the first theme. Okay, that is the first thing you hear in a sonata allegro form. Then there's some material that allows the modulation to occur. This section, usually the texture changes. It sounds more unstable. And then there's usually a cadence. The music comes to a brief pause, and then now that the key is changed, that new key area is introduced by another melody, a melody that contrasts with the first theme, and we call that the second theme. Often after that melody is introduced, there are a number of other melodies that kind of confirm that new key that the piece has modulated to. Okay. Usually there's another big cadence at the end of the exposition. Then in the next section, the development, the composer takes motives of each one of the two themes and presents them scrambled, garbled, in different orders, loud and soft. And in the development section, the composer often modulates through a number of different keys. So the development feels really unsettled, often like you kind of don't know what's going to come next. And that unsettled section, when it ends, it takes us back to the original key. So it brings us back home to the original key and the first melody that we heard. This new section is called the recapitulation. So it begins exactly like the piece began, with the first theme in the tonic key. And then all the material of the exposition is presented again, but the difference is there's no modulation this time. So the second theme, instead of being in a new key, is now in the tonic key again. It's like all the material you've heard comes back again, but it's transformed in some way. And that transformational element is what made Sonata Allegro form so exciting. Like I said, it's kind of like an essay. The development is where you would present all of your reasons and your ideas, and then the recapitulation is where you confirm the idea, the ideas that you've been arguing from the beginning. And I guess what makes it interesting is the way that now that you've been convinced, those ideas seem different. They seem transformed in some way. One of the pieces you're going to listen to is a late symphony by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It's in a minor key. So the first theme and the exposition is in a minor key. Then it transitions, the bridge section takes us to a major key. Okay? When that material comes back in the recapitulation, all of the music that you've heard before is now presented in a minor key. So there's that transformational element. And so what I've done here in this slide is show you what the second theme sounds like in the exposition, where it's in a major key, and then contrasting it with what it sounds like in the recapitulation in a minor key. So here's what it sounds like in a major key. Okay, and here's what the same material sounds like in the recapitulation in a minor key. You can hear there's a difference there, and that is sort of how Sonata Allegro form was like telling a story, making something dramatic out of this piece of instrumental music that doesn't have any words. Okay, so that ends our first mini lecture. I hope this was helpful. Of course, if you have any questions, if you didn't understand anything I said, you can visit one of our office hours on Wednesday at noon or Thursday at 5 p.m. Or you can always send me an email, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you guys and connecting with you. Talk to you again soon.